Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are going to be facilitating an off-campus small group through Dayspring's ministry. This video is designed to help you get ready as you prepare to facilitate that small group time. So if you have a copy of this week's Going Deeper guide, the handout that you and your group are going to be using during your small group time, go ahead and get that copy in front of you and get something to write down with you. I'm going to talk through that handout with you and give you maybe some ideas to bring to the table as you lead your small group this week. So let's do that together, and hopefully this will be beneficial for you in your preparation. You've got the handout in front of you. It's dated September 21 through September 27. And here's what this small group, let me give you an overview before we get into the details of the handout. This particular small group discussion centers around faith. It's going to complement the Sunday sermon. In the Sunday sermon, we looked at Abraham and Isaac, and we talked about the promise that God had made to Abraham and how eventually he saw that. He saw the child that God had promised and that God was going to send a blessing to the world through. So the sermon's on faith and the promises of God and all of those things. This particular small group discussion is going to complement that. And really what you're getting at in this particular group discussion, here's really the stream that you're trying to get everyone to walk to. You're trying to answer the question, what constitutes legitimate faith? I mean, there are a lot of things that we say we have faith in, and there are a lot of people of faith, so to speak, but God doesn't recognize everyone's beliefs as legitimate faith. So what constitutes legitimate faith? That's what this lesson is going to be talking about, and that's eventually where you're headed. You're going to have two truth statements that are basically spelled out for you in this handout on discussion point number 5 and discussion point number 8. Those are the 2 points, so to speak, that you're trying to lead everybody to and to process and to learn from. Now, let me say this as the group leader, as part of your preparation. There's a great study resource available to you if you want to make use of it that would really help you in understanding the content of this lesson. It's a sermon from our sermon archive here at Dayspring. If you were to go back to the summer of 2013 or in May of 2013, we did a sermon series on faith. And we answered really some of the questions that you're going to be answering in the small group lesson. So if you were to listen to the sermon dated May the 12th of 2013, you will hear a lot of things that are going to supplement this handout, because I preached on the same passage that you and your group are going to be discussing, and really it was on the same subject matter, on faith and how faith is defined and all of those things. So if you really want to get some answers and maybe some additional information or illustrations that may be helpful for you as you facilitate this small group discussion, listen to that sermon on May the 12th, 2013. You can find it on the sermon archive on the website. But that may be really helpful to you, okay? Now, having said all of that, let's look at the handout together, all right? And I'll walk you through it sort of point by point here. It starts off with discussion point number 1, which leads you to some of the things that we'll cover in the Sunday sermon. Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. You and your group will read that together. That should prompt your recollection of the Sunday service. And then after that, oftentimes on discussion point number 1, it simply says, read this passage and then recap what you heard Sunday. But the question here is a little different. Look at it. After you read that passage, it says, who are some people you've known whose faith inspired you? And obviously that question is going to stem from the reading that you just did on the life of Abraham, because you're going to read where God made a promise to Abraham, and it says that he believed him. He believed God. He believed the promise that God had made. So it's really an inspiring story of faith when we read Abraham's life. Now you're saying, who are some people you've known whose faith was impressive to you? Their faith inspired you. What you need to do as the group leader, you need to go ahead and have an answer to this question, okay? So think through it. Begin thinking through that now. Who's someone in your life? Maybe it's a relative or a church leader or someone that you knew. But their faith, you would say of them, they believed God, they really trusted God, and they lived by faith. Go ahead and have an answer to that question, because your group members may need some time to think that through and to come up with an answer to that. So while they are thinking it through, you can go ahead and say, here's somebody whose faith inspired me or still does inspire me, and you can sort of tell that story, then allow them time to share the stories of the people of faith that have inspired them. But that gets the ball rolling for this lesson, okay? Then you move on to discussion point number 2. It introduces Hebrews 11 to all of you as a chapter of the Bible that talks about people of great faith. And then it instructs you to read verse 1 together. Here's verse 1. Let me read it to you. It says, "Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see." So faith is being sure of what we hope for. So when you read this in Hebrews 11 verse 1, and your discussion point number 2 leads you to this point, faith and hope aren't necessarily one and the same. It seems that faith is bridged a little deeper. There's a hope that we have, but faith is being certain of that hope. So faith and hope aren't necessarily one and the same. Now look at the question that you're asked on discussion point number 2. It says, have you ever believed something that proved to be nothing more than a hope or a wish? In other words, has there ever been a time where you said, I have faith in something, I really believe in something, but turns out that you really shouldn't have had faith in that as much as it was just a hope or a wish? So in other words, you're saying, is there something that you really believe to be true that comes to find out it was just you were really hoping it would come true, but it wasn't going to be true? So, whether that's, a childish thing that maybe we all believed when we were children, then we found out wasn't true, or if it's a more serious thing in your life, maybe you were certain, you really believed one time that you were going to get a job that God was going to give to you, and then it turns out, I guess that was just wishful thinking because it didn't happen. Or maybe it was a physical thing, a condition of some sort. But has there ever been a time where your hope, it really just stayed there? You're asking that question. Now from there, you move on to discussion point number 3, which instructs you to read verses 2 through 7. Now 2 through 7 of Hebrews 11, in case you don't have your Bible in front of you, it just begins to rattle off story after story of people of faith. By faith, Abel did this. By faith, Enoch did this. By faith, Noah did this. And then down in verse 8, it gets into Abraham, but we don't make it to him in your reading. But it says, by faith, this person did this. By faith, this person did this. Now, look at the discussion point number 4. So discussion point 3, you just read it and move on. Look at discussion point number 4. It says, God defined what these people exercised as faith. So God said, these people, whether it was Abel, Enoch, Noah, what they had and what they practiced was faith. That's according to God himself. Look at discussion point number 4. It says, the question for us then is this: what constitutes actual faith? What separates faith from just well-wishing or optimism? That's the question that this whole group discussion is trying to answer. What's the difference between faith and just hoping for something, just wanting and wishing for something? What's the difference there? Back to discussion point number 4, it's kind of answering the question for you, sort of. It says the answer is found in the examples of those in Hebrews 11. Take Noah, for example. Now look at this. It says he did some outrageous things. With the ark and all of that, he did some outrageous things. And God said that this was faith. God defined it as faith. Now here's the question. But why did Noah do these specific things? Why did Noah build an ark? Why did Noah warn people? Why did he put his family on this boat? Why did he do all of this? Now, the answer to that question is, and you and your group should come up with the answer to this relatively quickly and easily. The answer is he did these things because God told him to. God told him a great flood is coming. God told him you need to build a boat. In fact, God even said, here's what the boat needs to look like, and here's the dimensions of it and all of it. Imagine the same story of Noah. Imagine the same story of Noah, but you remove from the story God telling him to do all of this. Imagine Noah, he builds this great ark, he's preaching at people, he's warning people, he's doing all this stuff, but God never told him to do it. That would be a different story, right? The difference is God spoke. God spoke, Noah did what God said, and God says that is faith. So that leads us to the first point that you're making, so to speak, in this lesson, which is discussion point number 5. You're just going to read this, okay? Look at it. Here's the lesson for us. Faith isn't legitimized simply because we deeply believe something to be true. It's legitimized when our belief is based on something that God actually has said. That's it. Faith, listen, faith isn't legitimized just because I deeply believe something to be true. Faith is legitimized when what I deeply believe to be true, I believe it because God has said it. Again, the account of Noah. If he was doing all of these things on his own, I don't know that we would call that faith. I think we would call it something else. We would call it him being crazy. We'd call it maybe a lot of other things. But because God had spoken it, it was faith. Let me give you an example. And maybe this is, maybe you can throw this kind of example out when your small group is meeting. But here's an example. Let's say that I drove to a neighboring state because they had a lotto going, and the purse for the lotto was like $90 million or something. Let's say I decided to drive over there and buy a lotto ticket, and I came back and I was telling you that I had this lotto ticket. Now, if you asked me what compelled me to go buy the ticket, other than the fact that, there's $90 million on the line, if you said, so why did you drive and go get the ticket? What if this was my answer? If my answer was, because I'm going to win. Because I'm going to win $90 million, I'm going to do good things with $90 million. And if I went on to say, not only am I confident that I'm going to win, but what if I started saying, God's going to let me win. God's going to let me win this. God's going to pour $90 million into my lap, and then after taxes, I guess I'll still have like half of it left. But God's going to give me all of this money so that I can do all of these things for God. Now, if I said that, does that mean it's going to happen? I mean, if I really believed it, if I deeply, deeply, deeply believed what I just told you, that God is going to let me win this, I really believe this is going to happen. Is that faith in God, or is that something else? That's the whole point here. Faith isn't legitimized just because I deeply believe something is going to happen. Now, that illustration is kind of lighthearted, and quite frankly, it really doesn't matter whether or not I win the money. But we do the same things with real serious matters, right? Maybe it's a sickness. Something's wrong with me physically, and I say, God's going to heal me because I believe it. A job situation. God's going to give me this job. Oh yeah, really? Yeah, because I'm claiming this in faith. Faith has nothing to do with how deeply I believe it, if God hasn't spoken it. Now, if God told me I'm going to win that money, if God told me that disease is going to go away, if God told me that job is mine, that's another thing altogether. But our point is, faith isn't legitimized simply because we deeply believe something to be true. It's legitimized when our belief is based on something that God actually has said. Now, that's going to challenge what a lot of people think. Now, discussion point number 6 is going to help you press this further. Look at it. It says, do you think we confuse what God can do and what God is going to do? Now, that's a great question. Can God make it to where I win that lottery ticket? Sure, he can make that happen. He can make those little balls pop up in the numbers that I've got. Can God heal any disease at any time? Of course he can. Can God get me that job or whatever? Of course he can. God can do anything. I have absolute confidence that God can do anything. Does that mean God is going to do anything? I think we confuse those things. And I think that what we believe that God can do, we claim it, quote unquote, in faith. But has God said he's going to do those things? That's really what you're getting at here. And here's the question on discussion point number 6. If we, quote unquote, claim something that God hasn't actually spoken, then what would you call that? If I do claim, let's go back to the lottery ticket. If I say God's going to make me win this, but God has no intent of making me win that. Then what is that? I wouldn't call it faith. What would you call it? I would call it hoping or well-wishing. At worst, I would call it presumption or even arrogance. That God's going to do what I said that he's going to do. Why? Because I believe it. That's not faith, y'all. It's not faith. Faith is legitimized not because I deeply believe something to be true, but because I deeply believe something to be true that God says is going to be true. And this may, that may break your group into a discussion of, does that mean that only what God has spoken in Scripture is true? Or does God speak individual promises to individual believers? You talk all of that out as a group. I think a verse that will be helpful to you in making this whole point about faith has to be connected to something God has said. Romans chapter 10, verse 17. It really defines faith for us. That's Romans 10, 17. It defines what faith is and where faith comes from. And it says it quite clearly. Faith comes from hearing what God has spoken. Okay? And of course, God has spoken his full word through Christ. All right. So that's the first point that you're making. All right. Now there's a second point that you're going to make, and it's really established in discussion point number 7. Look at it. It says, sometimes God speaks and we act upon it, but things don't, quote unquote, work out right. And when that happens, we just assume that our faith must have been illegitimate or flawed. Think about it. Noah, his story works out right. He acted as if there's going to be a flood. There was one. Abraham, his story acted out right. He had the son that he hoped and believed that he would have. Rahab, her story worked out right. Enoch, his story worked out right. Does that mean that they had faith, that was, they had legitimate faith, therefore things worked out right? Well, not necessarily, because in the same chapter of Hebrews, verses 36 through 39, which discussion point number 7 leads you to look at, let me read those for you. Listen to this. This is still the chapter of people whose faith God is commending. Verse 36, it says, some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. Now, that's not a good ending, is it? They were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world wasn't worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in the caves and holes in the ground. But listen, they were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. So think about it. Here's a group of people. Their story didn't work out, I'm sure, the way that they wanted it to. Yet God himself says they had a faith that was legit. Their faith was legit. Which brings us to the second point that you're learning in this lesson. Look at discussion point number 8. That when God speaks and our lives testify that we believe him, that what he has said, we believe that it is so, that's faith, regardless of how things work out. That's the point. Faith has nothing to do with whether or not I really believe something. Faith has nothing to do with whether or not the story works out the way that I hoped or envisioned it would. Faith is nothing more and nothing less than this: hearing God speak and acting upon that as if what he has said is so. That's what faith is. So that's really what you're discussing in this lesson. It's a learning lesson. What is faith? And this is going to challenge some of you. It's going to open your eyes for some of you. But this is what faith is. And God calls us to be people of faith. People like Abraham who believe God, and it's credited to us as righteousness. That should be our hope and our goal for our own lives, is that God himself would look at us and say, now that right there is a person who has legitimate faith. Well, this is what it looks like. Your discussion guide leads you to finish up in discussion point number 9 by just memorizing your weekly verse together. That should be easy enough this week. Galatians chapter 3, verse 6. Look at it. It says, consider Abraham. Think about him. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness because he had legitimate faith. Hey, thanks for listening in on this. I hope it's been helpful to you. I hope you and your group have a great discussion time together and that you bond one another around the Word of God. Hey, thanks for listening in. We'll see you Sunday.
world.